listeners. Welcome to another episode of the Right Word Podcast. This is a podcast talking about books and writing and reading and all the process involved therein. My name is N.N. Shepard. I'm joined with Josiah Furcinitti here.
What's going on, everybody?
Today, we are talking about Ernest Hemingway and 7 tips that he has for writing. Josiah, do you want to run us through those tips real quick?
Absolutely. So here they are. Tip number 1, start with a true sentence. Number 2, stop writing for the day while you still know what's coming next. Number 3, don't think about the story when you're not working. Number 4, begin each writing session by reading what you've written so far. Number 5, don't describe emotions, create them. Number 6, write with a pencil. Number 7, be brief. Now, obviously, Ernest Hemingway is a famous author, very well known. Yeah. He's put out a lot of works that have stood the test of time, For Whom the Bell Tolls.
The Old Man and the Sea, The Snows of Kilimanjaro. I have that one. I've not read very much of it. I think it's a collection.
Yeah. So, bottom line, he put out some really good stuff and he put out a lot of stuff. So it's always good to take heed when someone is doing something well and you want to do that thing. It's always good to take heed, even if you don't necessarily agree, which I think, and then it's safe to say we don't 100% agree with everything in this list per se.
Yes, true.
But I think, again, the ideas behind them are really good. And I think just paying attention to, hey, this guy was a master of the craft. What does he have to say about it and why? So without further ado, let's dive in. So, tip number 1, start with one true sentence. Here's what Hemingway has to say about that. When starting a new story and struggling to get it going, I would sit by the fire, squeeze orange peels into the flame, and watch the blue sputter. I would remind myself, don't worry, you've written before, and you'll write now. And then what do you think about this first tip?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty solid tip. Something, we mentioned last episode, 2 episodes ago, talking about kind of breaking through the writer's block and writing down something, putting down one line, one sentence, one word. So I think this is a good place to start. Start with one true sentence, something that's real, something that pertains to your story. True sentence, maybe that's open for interpretation. Is he saying true in like our real world sense? Do I need to write down 50 cents it equals 2 halves of a dollar as a true sentence? Or do I need to write down, Gerald woke up at 7:30 every morning because that's the character in the story? I don't, you know what I mean? Like what does that mean? What does he mean by saying that's something true? Is it just write down one thing, get yourself going? Or is it literally like a true real world sentence?
Yeah, so here's the way I took that, and to me, this is so good, but here's the way I took it. Write something that is true to you as a writer, and that is true to the story. Because I know that I have both read and written stories that you can tell whoever sat down to write it, or when I'm sitting down to write it, they're trying to really sound profound. They're trying to really write a good story. You know what I mean? Right. You start to read it, and it's like, yeah, I mean, this is like, the prose is almost too rich. Like there's too much description. There's too much metaphor. There's too much imagery happening here because this person is trying to pull you in or trying to, set it up. I read a book recently that's a really good example of that, is that the beginning of each chapter, it felt like, oh boy, here we go. We got this, super flowery prose, just a lot going on literarily.
Yeah.
And it's like, it almost clouds the story. And then as the action starts to pick up, you can tell the author was really getting into it. And now it's story. And again, I've written stuff where I look back at it now and I see like, okay, that first sentence, I'm just trying to throw a metaphor in there to try to sound fancy. But again, as you get into it, you know what I mean? It's like you get into the story, you're getting into the writing. And so for me, that's kind of what he's saying is don't start trying to write the great American novel of your time. You know what I mean? Write one true sentence that you believe in for yourself as a writer, and that fits with the story. You know what I mean?
I think you nailed it. You convinced me. Yeah, I think that's really, really good advice. Because writing ourselves in our own work, we can easily try to be too much of this or that and sell something that isn't necessarily true to us. So yeah, I think that's really good advice.
Absolutely. So yeah, I think that's just a great place to start. I love how you brought it back to that writer's block thing too. Because again, I think in writer's block, there is also sometimes the pressure of, I've got to write something great to get myself out of this. Yeah. No, you don't. You got to write something, And the best stories are going to be the true ones.
Yes.
So I think that's a great tip. Start with one true sentence. And then Shepard, you want to kick us off with tip number 2?
Absolutely. Let's pull it up here. So, number 2, Hemingway says, "Stop writing for the day while you still know what's coming next." He elaborates on that to say, "Always stop when you're going well and know what will happen next. That way, you'll avoid getting stuck." This, I think, is really good advice. I think, I've heard before, and I think Stephen King said something like this. Maybe not, but I've years and years ago, I heard some similar advice to this, where it was, you have a limited amount of energy for writing every single day, and that's just true in whatever craft you're doing, whether it's a regular job, whether it's something artistic. There's some amount of energy for that thing, and if you just burn through it all in one day, then the next day you won't have as much, and so you'll need to replenish those reserves. And so it's important to sort of pace yourself. And so, if things are going really well, stop before you run out. And so that way you can build up that reserve again, and then you can carry that momentum onto the next day. And yeah, I think this is just really, really solid, sound advice. Don't do too much, and leave some for the next day, because that way you have that consistency. And that's something that you and I have talked about. Consistency is key. It's the most important thing. Just daily writing, consistently writing. And so if you do too much, you might burn out and not have enough for the next day.
Yeah, that's really good. Just thinking about it as you do have a limited amount of energy, both creative, physical, in every sense. You have a limited amount. You don't want to push yourself just to get something done. And again, I really like this tip. This is one that I think N. Shepard and I had seen this somewhere online, sent it to each other, and we're just like, man, these are really cool. And it was something that this tip is one I hadn't thought about. And it was one that I started implementing, especially as I'm doing this 1K a day challenge where I'm writing 1,000 words a day. I know that I can't just follow a burst of creativity today and then tomorrow have nothing. I know I can't do that. I've got to have something. So if it's going really hot, going really well, it's true. You want to be excited about getting back to the desk tomorrow. You don't want to dread getting back to the desk. And if you're stopping while you still know what's coming, while you still have something to write to, you're excited about it. It doesn't become this thing that you got to dredge yourself out of bed and drag yourself to the desk and, oh, I got to be creative. I don't think creativity should ever be something that you have to be. It's something that we get to be. It's the cream on top. Now, I think there are more and lesser extents that you can take this. Like, for example, I tried the other day just writing a sentence, and I could say I was approaching my 1,000 words for the day. And I was in the middle of this scene where it's a nightmare scene. Things are really getting intense. They're moving towards this climactic point, this really scary climactic point. And when I get into those scenes, everything tends to become really short and compact. So it's shorter sentences, but there's a lot happening in those short sentences. And it just kind of grows and compounds on itself. And I was in the middle. I was about to hit my 1,000 words, and I was literally in the middle of a sentence. I think it was with it. And I stopped. I'm like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to, and I think that was probably taking it a little too far, because I kind of ruined the momentum and I was not able to get back into that heat, the way that I probably would have been. So I think you can take it too far and say like, no, I'm going to stop. But I think there is something to saying, well, I'm still excited. I'm still confident. There's a difference between being confident of knowing what's coming next and being arrogant about it and like, I'll figure it out. That's different than saying, well, I do know that this character has to get to this point, or that this dream sequence has to end, or whatever. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, that's a good insight, because you definitely can. I mean, that's with everything, right? There's moderation involved in some level of self-awareness in what you need to do. So it's good advice, but good advice taken too far becomes something bad. So that's a really good point, a good understanding of it.
All right, next up we have number 3, and this is probably the first one that I would say I really kind of disagree with. So with that little thing, let's jump in here. Number 3, don't think about the story when you're not working. He goes on to say, never empty the well of your writing. Stop with something left. Let it refill naturally at night. And then Shepard, what do you think about that? Should we think about our work in progress while we are not working?
Yeah, I think so. I do. I agree with you in that I disagree with this tip. And to me, it's weird because it seems to sort of contradict tip number 2, because if I'm ending the day with leaving some in the tank, that sort of feels like I'm still have something that I'm thinking about. It's still in my head. And if the story is something that I'm passionate about and I'm interested in, I find it's hard for me to remove it from my thoughts. I'll be done writing and I'll go talk to my wife and I'll say, hey, here's this thing that I had today. I'm trying to figure out this problem in the story, whatever it is. Or I'm taking a shower and I'm just standing in the shower thinking about it. Whatever usually if it's intriguing and if I'm interested in what I'm writing about, it's in my thoughts. And so I think it'd be hard to kind of remove that. And I personally think that kind of goes with the second point, which is, if I give myself the chance to replenish and have some of that energy and the momentum going into the next day, then I'm still thinking about it. I'm still thinking about the things that, if I know what chapter, the next chapter needs to look like, well, then it's still in my head a little bit and I can kind of like softly carry that momentum into the next day without having to actually put the work in. So it is interesting because we're disagreeing with Ernest Hemingway. So it's like, who am I to say that I think he's wrong here? But I do think this is not, and it's, different for everybody. Obviously for him, maybe it makes more sense to just shut your brain off and writing only happens between these certain hours every day. But for me, I like it when I'm obsessed with the story and it's in my brain all the time. I think if I'm going to try to pace myself, I'm constantly, there's like a little bit of my brain that's thinking about it all the time, no matter what I'm doing. That's right. Me. Josiah, what do you think?
No, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And I think I just totally agree with that. I think some of the best solves or best plot points have come when I'm just meditating and thinking about that story during the day. Funny enough, sometimes I'll be listening to another audiobook, and just not even just an idea from the story I'm listening to, but just again, like having stories constantly going through your head can sometimes help you figure out like, oh yeah, I'm not following the character, am I? I'm trying to hit a certain plot, whatever it may be. I find that thinking throughout the day about my story, I've worked my way out of problems. I've given myself a huge plot hole, realized it while thinking about it, and then I write it down and know that I can come back to it later. And once again, I think there's a spectrum to this answer in that you don't want to obsess over your story and just turn over every little thing. That's something to do on second draft when the story's all done. That's the time to really obsess and think about every single angle. But when you're first doing first draft, you're just putting down the story. You're trying to get from A to Z. You're not trying to figure out what the transition from, Q to R is. You know what I mean?
Right.
So that, I think you can kind of get obsessive and almost discourage yourself, where once again it becomes this daunting thing to come back to the story if you're obsessing. But again, I think to think about it, I think you need to do that. I think you need to let it percolate. And I think sometimes, again, that happens naturally.
Yeah.
While you're sleeping, while you're showering, whatever, it'll just pop into your head. But I think some intentional focus on, okay, let me think about the work I did today and see how that feels, see how that, whatever it may be.
Yeah, I agree. 100%. Well said.
And then Shepard, tip number 4.
Number 4, begin each writing session by reading what you've written so far. When it gets too long to read it all, go back a couple of chapters each day. Then each week, read from the beginning. I think it's good to a point because the longer you've written, the more of your novel, if you're writing a novel, the more of it that you've written, the harder it is and the more time consuming it is to go back all the way to the beginning, which I think is where like keeping notes and keeping track of kind of what you're doing is valuable. So you can just remember, okay, chapter 6, I wrote this, and this is kind of an important bullet point. Chapter 12 says this, that's important. That way you don't have to go back and go through the whole thing. I do think tonally it's good, especially, I think tonally it's good to, go back and read some of what you wrote before. Maybe that's the chapter that you wrote before, the day before, or a paragraph or two. And that just gets you kind of in the tone of how you're writing the story. Because I think if you're an active writer, then you're hopefully an active reader. And so sometimes, you can maybe pull some of those things that you're reading into your own writing. And you do want to have your own voice as an author, or at least you want to try to. So I think one of the things that you can help fix that, and something that Hemingway says here is, just reading what you wrote the day before helps you just kind of get right back into the groove of things, right in line. and reminds you of the momentum that you carried on if you follow tip number 2. That's kind of my thought on it.
Yeah, I love that. That's really good. I think, yeah, the most important thing there that you were talking about is tone. You do want to keep voice consistent because readers will be able to tell if you
Yeah.
are one chapter is in one voice, one tone, you have this certain mood, and then all of a sudden it switches. That's an inconsistency that I think one takes you out of the story, and
Yeah.
it can put your book, firmly into the DNF, do not finish pile.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
Because it's hard, especially if you're doing first person. I think then it really comes in important
Mm-hmm.
because it's like if you are listening to someone tell a story for 60,000 words, 100,000 words, in terms of audiobook, that's like between 8 and 12 hours. If you're going to listen to someone and be with them and hear their story for that long, it has to be easy to listen to. It has to
Yeah.
be, you know what I mean?
Consistent.
It's got to be consistent. Exactly. Consistency. You're going to hear that a lot on this podcast.
Yeah.
Consistency is key.
Yep.
In terms of actually reading, I know for me, I think exactly what you said. I think you said it really well. And then is like read at least the, chapter or the paragraph or two before. I'm not
Yeah.
going back and reading from the beginning
Right.
because again, it's like I've got limited time that I have to sit and write, and I want to be productive with that time.
Yeah.
And I think what you want to keep consistent is the voice, the tone. In terms of the details and stuff like that, yes, of course that's important. But one, like you said, you can take notes, and you should be taking notes to keep things consistent, to know kind of where you're going. And two, you have second draft. So that's when you're going to really be, again, a second, or even, I would say probably that's even a third draft thing, is you're paying attention to all the minute details of this character said this, or their birthday is then, and I accidentally put it here. So in terms of story consistency, hopefully the story is formed enough in your mind where on first draft even you're kind of following the same path. But even if it's not and you're missing things here and there, that's something you can fix in later drafts and that you should hopefully be taking some notes for along the way.
Yeah, for sure. I think too, there could be a danger of if you go back and you read too far, you might start editing some of that stuff. And unless it's major plot points that you realize you need to fix, it's not that beneficial because, yeah, like you said, you're going to have second draft, third draft, fourth, depending on how tight everything is when you write it. And that can just really slow you down because editing extensively in the first draft can really slow you down. But then if you go back and you say, okay, I'm going to go back to chapter 1 and I'm already in chapter 40, it's like, man, that's a lot of reading. Like you said, not everybody has time to do that yet until you're a published author. But even then, I feel like once you're a professional author and that's what your full-time job is, I feel like, yeah, it can take some of the wind out of the sails and you can get into that editing mindset too early, maybe. So yeah, I think there's a limit probably, and that depends on the person, obviously. But for me, yeah, just a chapter, a few paragraphs, nothing too crazy so that I don't get bogged down in editing.
Oh, that's so good. Yep, right on. All right, number 5. Don't describe emotions, create them. Newspaper writing tells what happened, often creating emotion through timeliness. Real writing, however, conveys the emotion as truthfully as possible. And then, Shepard, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's good. It's the classic, don't tell me, show me. Get people to understand the emotions without just saying he was sad. Describe him being sad, that kind of thing. I recently read a book by C.S. Lewis. Well, it wasn't by C.S. Lewis, but it was a collection of letters that he had written in response to people about writing. So the book is all about writing from C.S. Lewis' standpoint. And one of the things that really stood out to me there is that he talks about describing words, adjectives. And he says, if you rely on all these things, you're basically just asking the reader to do the work for you. Because you're just saying, okay, this was beautiful, or this was scary, or this was, hilarious. It's like, so then as a reader, I just have to imagine what beautiful looks like. I have to imagine what scary is. I have to imagine what hilarious seems like. And so I think in the same exact way, emotion is not necessarily just for how humans respond to things, but also just the atmosphere of the world that you're creating. And so I think that advice is just really poignant and something that is hard to do sometimes because it's easy for me to just write down, he was sad. It's just like he said sadly, Not that that's the best grammar, but kind of taking that shortcut rather than putting a little bit more effort into describing the emotion, describing why this person would feel this way, describing why the scene looks like this, and then letting the reader extrapolate from that the emotions that I'm trying to convey. So I do think this is a hard piece of advice, and it's probably the difference between good and mediocre writers. But I do think it's pretty important.
Man, well said. I don't know how much more I can add to that because that was well said. But yeah, I think it is just that the best piece of writing advice I ever received was show, don't tell. It's just, yeah. And I think, again, making them feel the emotions of what's going on. It's the difference between little Johnny was afraid of his father, and Johnny could hear his father slamming the door and stomping over to the table, and describing how he would yell at his wife for the dinner to be ready, and he would yell for if Johnny did whatever. There's a difference between just saying that Johnny's afraid of his father and you kind of skim past it and say, okay, that doesn't have it. Between that and just seeing why Johnny's afraid of his father and what that emotionally does to him is going to affect you a lot more as a reader, that you're actually seeing in real time, like, oh my gosh, you don't have to say the word afraid once. You don't have to say anxiety. You don't have to say the word abuse. And you instantly know, you can feel that that's exactly what's happening there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So again, that's such an impactful thing. If you want to reach your readers, if you want to do something more than tell facts, if you want to be a writer, you got to learn how to create emotions rather than describing them.
Very well said.
And then Shepard, take us through tip number 6, my personal favorite.
Number 6 from Ernest Hemingway says, write with a pencil. Writing with a pencil gives you 3 chances to revise. First, when reading over, then when typing, and finally in the proof.
Yeah, from the guy who didn't even have a computer.
Yeah, so we're in 2 different worlds here, Ernest. Let's be a little bit realistic. I don't know. For me personally, I don't like this advice. I can see the point. I can see what he's trying to say with this. A pencil is a little bit more meticulous, and it's a little bit harder to do, and it's slower. And so maybe that makes you more brief, and it lets you, not just ramble on, and you just, because you don't want to sit there and just get carpal tunnel all day long. But I don't know that it's necessary. I think you can still write a first draft well. I think you can still have that sense of brevity with a keyboard, with typing. I don't know that you need to go archaic, and maybe you do. There's too many distractions. The distractions of a computer is too many. The distractions of even a typewriter is too many, and so you need to go pen and paper in a writing shack. That's fine. I'm not trying to judge on any of that, but I think if you can sit down and write on a keyboard, I don't know that you need to throw that out because of this advice. Yeah, and I know there's a couple authors who do it, who write on paper first. I want to say that Aragon, written by Christopher Paolini, I believe he wrote that whole book on paper and then transferred it to computer. Now I think he was 14 or 15 when he wrote that. So
no,
I don't know if that changed.
Really?
Yeah. His story is very, very interesting. I don't love the books. I've only read the first book. I don't love the first book because it does seem like it's written by a teenager, which it is. But the way that he sold those and marketed those, that would be another podcast maybe that we discuss. But to get to this, yeah, I don't know. I think if you're trying to get into writing and you have an idea for a story and you start with a Word document and then you read this advice, I don't think you need to throw that document out and just go with pen and paper. I think the computer is totally fine if you can still get the words down.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think if we're talking just in terms of principle, because I think the principle of what he's saying here is take your time and go over it a bunch of times. Like, because again, if you write it by hand, you're going to have to type it eventually if you want to do anything with it. So I think in principle, this idea of repetition, be in your story constantly, being in a lot, take a lot of times reading it, take your time writing it. I completely agree in principle, but I think to do it literally, I know also for me, anyone in my life can attest that my handwriting is less than legible. Even I myself have trouble reading back what I
Same.
wrote sometimes.
Same.
So it's
Absolutely
like if
same.
I, I would definitely like it would be like 4 different stories if I was to do that, by hand.
Yeah.
And I think it's just super slow. It's super frustrating that
Yeah.
like I know a lot of times I can't even keep up with my hands of what I see in my head. I can't even keep up with my
Yes.
fingers. So it's
Yes.
like maybe that's a good thing because it'll cause me to stop. Maybe that's not a
Hmm.
good thing. Maybe it's actually maybe that's part of who I am as a writer is just that speed trying to keep up at certain times. You know what I mean? I don't know how to say what
Yeah.
I'm trying to say, but
No, I totally get you. Yeah. Because yeah, if I'm trying to write, if I'm trying to, write with my handwriting, uh, and I'm trying to be somewhat legible, it's very, very slow. And if I'm trying to write fast, I'm trying to take notes or something. Like I'll take notes in church and write it down on the bulletin, and then go home and like look over the notes. And yeah, I can't read most of it because I'm trying to write down as fast as the preacher's talk, and it's like, okay, what is the value of me writing those notes down? Because I
right.
can't, I sort of understand the gist of what I was writing, but I don't really know. And so I think if I was trying to write down a novel, I think for one, yeah, it would be extremely slow, because some scenes when you're writing, the scene is so fast, and it's like this thing. We've talked about a found thing. You're kind of discovering it, and if you look away, you're going to miss what's going on. And so as fast as I can type is almost too slow. Just sometimes it seems like it's too slow for the story that's going on, and so I can't imagine writing that down when the scene is rushing by, and my sloppy handwriting is either not going to be legible, and I'm going to forget the scene later on,
Right.
or I'm going to try to make it legible, and then I'm going to forget. I'm going to miss what's going on. So yeah, I don't.
right.
For myself, it doesn't work.
Yeah. In principle, yes. In
Yeah.
literal application, probably not.
Yes.
And this brings us to our last tip. Be brief. The
Mm.
Gettysburg Address was brief by design. The rules of prose are as unchanging as those of physics. And then, Shepard, tell us your thoughts on this last tip.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I think I think his little blurb there, the rules of prose are as unchanging as the rules of physics. That's very eloquent and very attractive sounding, because it is true. Things that work always work, and sometimes there's rules that you can break and make things new, but ultimately that kind of reinforces the rule. In fantasy, especially, science fiction doesn't, I don't think, suffer from this as much, but some fantasy books can just be massive. And I realize you're building a world, but it's a lot of times it's not that necessary. And Stephen King, who I've read not enough of his books, but I've read a couple dozen, something like that. Um, some of them are very, very long, but the thing that he does really well is that the stuff in them seems to be important.
Right.
And it's mostly character, and his worlds are set, for almost all of his books are set in our world. And so it's he doesn't have to invent all this other stuff, which you might see in a fantasy world where it's Lord of the Rings. Okay, Middle Earth is new. I have to invent and explain all these things. Um, and so I think, yeah, we can just go too far with length, and especially in the fantasy world, it seems like your book is not really a book unless it's 500 pages long, or it needs to have just this amount of words in it. You need to have 200,000 words in your debut novel, otherwise you're not going to sell your epic fantasy. And I don't know. I think sometimes it works and sometimes it's necessary, but oftentimes, we can just get too long in the teeth with some of this stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think a very key thing, just to kind of wrap this up here, a very key thing to remember is that in writing, there is a difference between short and brief. We're not
Mm,
saying don't make your story, we're not saying make your story short. Like,
yeah.
okay, I got to cut out a bunch of plot lines and a bunch of characters. No, no, no. Just be brief, right? There's a difference between small and compact. There's a difference between taking what you need to say and putting it into a nice package that's not doesn't have a bunch of wasted filler words and doesn't have a bunch of descriptions that really mean nothing emotionally, that don't have any impact or anything like that.
Right.
It is possible to say the same thing in 2 different sentences, and one of them be short, punchy, and effective, and one of them be long-winded and have all these extra words and that you're taking really long, and ultimately the reader's going to skip over that.
Yeah.
right? If they have one sentence that's really short and gets the point across and makes them feel something, and they see this next paragraph that's just this dense, dense, dense thing, and it's saying the same thing, and there's something really good in there,
Yeah.
they're going to skip over that and miss the really good thing that you have to say because you have all this extra words and all this extra fluff.
Yeah. This is maybe I don't know, a sideways point. But do you think brevity has become more of an important issue in the digital age? With you look at old books of like a War and Peace or Moby Dick or Tale of Two Cities, some of these longer, just big doorstopper books, not in the fantasy genre, so I can't even use that as an excuse. Just regular fiction novels, um, they were massive and they were long. And do you think that just our attention spans or any of that kind of stuff that experts quote unquote would say, all these social media things are making our attention span short? Do you think that has a play into it, or do you think that, like Hemingway says, the rules of writing have always been, and the rules of prose are as solid as the rules of physics, and brevity is important now as it always has been?
That is such a good question. And I think it's realizing the difference between an ideal world and the real world that we live in, right? As much
Mm,
as I would like to be able to write something that has all these different themes and all these different descriptions that I think are important, I got to realize that right now, where I am as a writer, in this moment, me, Josiah Furcinitti, I don't have a voice with the world. They don't
yeah,
have any reason. If I were to write something that was a 450,000, you know, 1,200 page long thing, who's going
right,
to, like, a publisher's not even going to take a chance on that, let alone some reader in a random bookstore. Because I don't have the voice, I don't have the authority behind my name that someone would pick that up. Maybe 200 years ago, that wouldn't be the case because there probably weren't as many people able to publish and as many books out there. There certainly weren't movies or TikTok or this or that, where people's
right,
attention spans, scientifically, it's proven they were longer back then.
yeah, yeah,
But the world that we live in now, that's such a great point, and that you bring up, is that the world that we live in now, people, their attention spans are shorter. You got to keep things more compact to get them in. And now hopefully it's a matter of kind of retraining our minds, us
mm,
as writers and us as readers, kind of retraining our minds to take our time and slow down and find the value in longer, or not longer, but maybe more verbose. I don't want to take in fluff just to try to retrain myself. But at the
right,
same time,
right,
there are things that are longer that are worth reading, like The Three Musketeers.
yeah,
Man, his prose is dense. It's hard to get through. He's saying a lot of things, but if you take the time, it's an amazing story. And even the way he's writing, it's really beautiful if you can
yeah,
appreciate it for what it is and not just say like, "Oh, this is too much." You
right,
know what I mean? So I think it's realizing real world versus ideal world. I think it's
mm.
being cognizant of your reader, being cognizant of yourself. Yeah, I think that all plays in for sure. That's a great point.
I think that's a fantastic response, because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what we'd like things to be, because it is what it is. And trying to break into the writing world, the publishing world, we have to some degree, do what works. And so, yeah, so being aware of that, I think, is really great. And we talk about Stephen King. His first novel is not as long as The Stand. You know, he
Not
did
even
he didn't start
close.
he didn't start out with The Stand. He didn't start out with it. Carrie is very short,
Yep.
and it's just punchy and grabby, and it gets you. And then he fluctuates throughout his career, and so yeah, I think you're spot on. We might like things to be a certain way, but it's not always the way it is, and we just kind of have to work with what we have.
Right. And I think there is the hope that you can hold on to. Like, for me now, Stephen King, I'm disappointed if he puts out like a novella or something.
Mm.
I'm disappointed if he puts out something really short. If I pick up the book and it's only
Yeah,
like 300 pages, I'm like, ah, come on, dude. You can, you
yeah,
couldn't give us a little more. So it's,
right,
having the hope that someday, if you
yeah,
just put your nose to the grindstone and you put out stuff that's, again, brief, compact, and hopefully always do that. Don't, be loosey goosey with your prose all of a sudden if you do happen to make it big. Like, don't get
right,
lazy.
yeah,
Still be concise, still work to be the best, but realize that, okay, there's this book that I want to write and then I am writing maybe. That's going to be on the longer side and it's going to be a little bit denser and it's going to take time for the reader to get through. Don't just throw that out. Don't give up on that. Don't say I'll never be able to publish it. Just realize that it may take a while, but you have hope for the future that, hey, establish yourself, work hard, work on that, writing something, compact and brief. And someday you will get to release those longer things that you want to work on.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's really good.
All right. So those were 7 tips from Ernest Hemingway on how to write well. We hope it's been helpful to you all. I know it's been helpful to me, and then I'm sure it's been helpful to you as well.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the Right Word Podcast. I'm Josiah Furcinitti. You can find me at www.josiahfurcinitti.com. And then Shepard, where can we find you?
You can find me at nnshepard.com, YouTube, TikTok.
Love it.
All under the same handle.
All right. We will see you next time.